Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
9 minutes before 8 is the time. Back to our conversation about the strikes in a moment, and indeed the role of London Mayor Sadiq Khan, who's just the ticket to go away on anything that he can, everything from Cinderella to European football, but doesn't seem to be helping the folk of London that much. But to other matters, laying down the law. Britain will tear up Euro laws that have been entrenched into UK courts in a new Bill of Rights, Dominic Raab will say today. Mr Raab writes a powerful piece in today's Sun newspaper. He's the Deputy Prime Minister, Justice Secretary, and he joins me now. Briefly, can you encapsulate what it is you'll be saying later today, Deputy Prime Minister? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, it's not so much what we'll be saying. We'll be publishing the Bill of Rights around lunchtime. That will set out the new law that we want to pass, a Bill of Rights to replace the Human Rights Act. And really there are two things at the heart of it, Nick. First of all, we want to strengthen and reinforce the UK tradition of liberty, free speech, the liberty that guards all the others. We want to see that strengthened, prioritised, given greater weight. And I think that reflects the history of this country. I think we should be proud about that. So I think it's pro-human rights in that respect. Of course, we've also seen under the Human Rights Act and the way it operates in conjunction with the European Court of Human Rights, elastic approaches to human rights, interpretations of the Convention. The goalposts have shifted, and we want to be clear that the Supreme Court does what it says on the tin. It's got the last word on the law of the land in this country, and that also when it comes and when the goalposts do shift, and we saw that, and you'll remember on prisoner voting, where the goalposts shifted, we were told there were new human rights obligations. Well, actually, if there's new or expanded approaches to the law, that's for Parliament to decide. Our Bill of Rights will encapsulate those two core aims.
So does Britain leave the ECHR, Mr Raab?
No, I don't think it's necessary to achieve the changes that we need. I don't think most people, when they look at the European Convention, think there's a problem with the principles it sets out. It's with the interpretation and the application of it, and particularly the licensing of elastic interpretations that we've seen under the Human Rights Act. So we're going to be very clear. The courts don't need to follow Strasbourg rulings. In fact, as a matter of case law, in fact, they are explicitly free to depart from it. We're going to be clear that the role of the courts is sure to interpret without fear or favour the law and the Bill of Rights and the European Convention, but it's not to amend or change legislation without the accountability of Parliament. And there's a range of other things. What I think ultimately it will do is it will strengthen things like free speech, but it will stop the challenges we've seen by serious foreign national offenders to deportation orders, claiming the right to family life. There's other proper practical policy operational things that we'll be able to do to protect the public, and I think that's the common sense people would like to see restored to the justice system.
And obviously, as people think back, they will alight upon the issue regarding asylum seekers to Rwanda. Under this new legislation, those flights would have been able to take place, would they, Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, there are complex claims, and the main hearing is set to take place in a few weeks, so I need to be careful a little bit about what I say. But let's just be clear on one point which has come up, which is the ability, once the UK courts have decided that notwithstanding the main hearing, the flights can proceed. I don't think it's right as a matter of law in this country that Strasbourg can then override the ruling of the UK High Court of Appeal, and we'll be explicit about that in the Bill of Rights.
OK. You rightly reference the prisoners' vote issue. Why did we not just ignore the ECHR as it regards the asylum seekers in Rwanda, from taking them to Rwanda, as we had regarding prisoners' rights?
Well, we haven't got as far with the litigation in relation to Rwanda as we had done with prisoner voting. It had been through several hearings in the UK. It had been subject to several rulings in the Strasbourg court, including other rulings on whether prisoners should be given the vote. So they're not identical situations. But I fully support the Home Secretary in taking a robust approach, and that's the way we're going to approach the litigation that we still face.
Many people say the Human Rights Act, which you are and your colleagues are seeking to replace, has been used successfully by the victims of the Hillsborough disaster, victims of the serial sexual attacker John Warboys, military veterans and disabled people enforcing their rights. Will the same be afforded to them in the new legislation?
So there's a string of cases that Liberty and the SNP have put out, and in each case it's just not true what they say.
So Hillsborough did not rely on it?
Well, either in something like Hillsborough, the inquiries that would happen would, of course, be safeguarded by the Bill of Rights, or, and the argument was made in relation to Windrush, which, of course, it's the anniversary of today. And actually, it's just not true to say that the Windrush scheme was the result of litigation using the Human Rights Act. It was a result of all the questions and scrutiny that MPs rightly posed within Parliament. So we'll address some of those, frankly, myths that are put around. But no one is talking about tearing up human rights in this country. We're staying within the European Convention. We're going to reinforce those quintessentially British rights like free speech. But I do think when it comes to public protection, people want to see a dose of common sense and balance provided. And that's what our reforms will achieve.
So victims of someone such as the serial sex attacker, John Warboys, would still have a voice under your new legislation?
Absolutely, they would still have a voice. Indeed, it is precisely in order to protect the public, to strengthen those charged with law enforcement at the operational front line, whether it's police, whether it's those engaged in border controls, whether it's parole reform. There is a risk under the Human Rights Act that the parole reforms we want to put through, which will allow a ministerial check on murderers, rapists, terrorists and child killers being released, all of those things will be subject to attack under the Human Rights Act. In order to safeguard our ability to put public protection first, we need this vital reform.
While I have the benefit of you on the line, just a couple of other matters. Obviously, we have concluded day one of the rail strikes. It is thought that talks will take place. I can't imagine they will avert tomorrow's strike, but if we're lucky, possibly Saturday's strike. Can you give us an update as where the government view this?
Well, I think it's deeply regrettable that we've got these strikes. Let's remember that the taxpayer through the government paid out £16 billion or £600 per household to see the railways through the pandemic. We've, of course, got to reform the way the railways operate, given the new ways to working and the effect that has on commuter travel. But there are also old practices which, frankly, are well out of date and unnecessary, which need to be reformed. And I think it's very regrettable that the taxpayer, and particularly students, if you like, blue-collar workers who need to get to work, cannot work remotely, are the ones that will be hit by these strikes more than anyone else. And I think Network Rail are taking the right approach. We know that the cost of living challenge is there. We know that it affects workers across the board. But the one thing that will keep inflation higher for longer and undermine pay packets for longer is if we have spiralling public sector pay increases beyond what is responsible. And that's what's at issue here. So it is precisely, sorry, Nick, final point, it is precisely to protect the wages of those on the lowest incomes that we need to hold the line.
But some people might be confused by the news today, by the way, which I welcome, that pensioners will have their triple lock reinstated, which will put them in line for increases of around 10 to 11%. So, and by the way, I support this. They get their 10 or 11%, Mr. Raab, but rail workers do not. How do you justify that?
I understand the question and I appreciate it. Look, the reality is that pensioners are in a different position. We judge them in a bespoke way. The triple lock was removed temporarily, so it's not like that we haven't looked very carefully. But the reason they're in a different position is their income is disproportionately affected by rising energy costs. Energy costs are a disproportionate amount of the bills and the challenge they face, and therefore, as we've done in other areas with the 37 billion pound package of support for the most vulnerable, we need to take bespoke measures just to see them through these tough times. Inflation will come down. It will come down. It's predicted to come down next year. The thing that will keep it higher for longer is spiralling wage demands, and whilst we understand what causes that, it is precisely to protect the pay packets of the poorest that we need to hold the line on these strikes.
Finally, Mr. Raab, much excitement that a Conservative fundraiser, I think earlier this week, £120,000 was bid to have dinner with Boris Johnson, Theresa May and David Cameron. That's one current and two former Prime Ministers. The call comes to you, Mr. Raab. They want a table for six. We need you, Dom, to come along. Beside whom would you choose to sit? Mr. Johnson, Mr. Cameron or Mrs. May?
I'll be delighted to sit with any of them at dinner.
Is it something you would relish? It's an interesting selection of dinner companions, isn't it, Mr. Raab?
Well, yes, but I've served three prime ministers, and it's been a great honour to serve all three of them. And obviously, I'm delighted to continue to do so.
And you think it will be a cordial atmosphere at that dinner? Would you pay 120 grand for that?
Look, I don't know about that, but yeah, of course. Look, the reality is that those who have done those frontline jobs, particularly, I mean, I haven't experienced it, but to be Prime Minister. Well, yeah, but it's not the same in reality, and I've got huge respect and always interested in listening to the perspectives of those eminent gris in the Conservative Party. But David Cameron probably won't forgive me for calling that.
Dominic Raab, thank you for your time. Deputy Prime Minister's Justice Secretary, appearing here on LBC 1 minute after 8. The news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, figures show inflation is still rising at its fastest rate in 40 years.